It is by no means a matter of mere politeness when I state that I'm happy to be with you today. These were the first words that Thomas Mann said in this congregation when he gave his talk in 1951. And they're true for myself as well, because when I wrote this book here 3 or 4 years ago, Thomas Mann's American Religion, and discovered the deep entwinement, the deep affiliation between Thomas Mann and this First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles, I wouldn't have expected to stand in this place and give a talk on this topic. I'm very grateful and happy to be here. The other book, indeed has you recognize it immediately, the entrance to this church building on its cover, was co-published by a colleague on the Ralph Waldo Emerson chair in Harvard, and myself, following up to that first book, the basic thesis of which I try to resume briefly. Although Thomas Mann's relationship to religion has been thoroughly investigated, his late and lasting embrace of the Unitarian Church has been ignored for a long time. This must come as a surprise, considering how strongly Thomas Mann expressed this relationship, not only during his American exile, but also back in Europe afterwards. For years, he wrote in 1951, "For years Unitarianism has been close to my heart, and, literally, rarely, if ever, have I taken so lively and militant an interest in the activities of any religious group. In many ways," he said at another opportunity, he felt connected to the Unitarians personally and intellectually. In 1950, he had written, "My interest in and warm sympathy for Unitarianism are of long standing. Moreover, the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles is particularly close to my heart and mind." Only a few months before his death in Kilchberg in Switzerland, Thomas Mann wrote to the Unitarian minister in Los Angeles, whom he called his friend, "The spirit of your church, it is this spirit that I find attractive since I got to know it." Thomas Mann did not speak of any other religious community in the same way. Seldom, if ever, did he feel closer to any confession or denomination than Unitarianism here in this community. This partiality became apparent in private life and in ritual. His youngest daughter, Elizabeth, and her husband were married in Princeton by a Unitarian minister. The Unitarian Service Committee helped his brother Heinrich and his son Goloman to escape from Europe during the war. All 4 grandchildren were baptized, I return to that in a minute, in this church. His brother Heinrich was buried here. Thomas Mann wrote for the parish newsletter of the First Unitarian Church and spoke in the pulpit next door during a service as some kind of guest preacher. And his friend, the minister Stephen Frischmann, continued to remember him after his death as one of our most cherished friends. And there is little reason to doubt that Thomas Mann felt just the same. For a long time, all of this has not played any role in the ongoing discussions about Thomas Mann and religion. This remarkable lack of interest, at least in Europe, might have to do with a transatlantic bias and a lack of knowledge about specifically American traditions. Thomas Mann's turn to the Unitarians epitomizes his effort to combine the political, the philosophical, and the religious traditions of his background with those rooted in America, in American culture, which he tried to adopt as far as possible and make his new home. This process had already begun long before Thomas Mann's exile, starting with a famous speech on the German Republic delivered in 1922 after the First World War, a speech that marked Thomas Mann's turn from conservatism toward democracy. While he was working on this text, he studied Emerson and Walt Whitman's poems and essays, mainly Democratic Vistas, which suddenly provided Thomas Mann with a new perspective on America. In an open letter to the translator, Thomas Mann called the German edition of Whitman a great, important, indeed sacred gift. Notes in Marx and Thomas Mann's copy show why. Following his friend and teacher Emerson, Whitman discusses the democracy of young America as the model for a utopian union of humankind, of humanity. And he notes, Whitman, I shall use the words America and democracy as convertible terms, marked by Thomas Mann in his copy. Immediately, this democratic universalism seeks into something genuinely religious, as Thomas Mann quotes in his famous speech. At the core of democracy, finally, is the religious element. All the religions, old and new, are there. In his speech, Thomas Mann quotes this phrase and makes it his own. His turn to democracy in 1922, inspired by Whitman and Emerson, already pointed towards Unitarianism, only he did not know it yet. Thus, at the beginning of his American exile, it was only a question of time before Thomas Mann's personal convictions, which were already similar to contemporary American Unitarianism and Universalism, should assume a tangible shape. The time came in 1940, with Golo and Heinrich Mann's dangerous escape from Nazi Europe due to the help of the Unitarian Service Committee. In 1954, Thomas Mann wrote reflectively that, in many ways I feel connected to the Unitarians, personally and intellectually. Then he adds, in her, the Unitarian Church, all my 4 grandchildren have been baptized, both boys and girls. Whenever his relationship with the Unitarian Church comes up, he never fails to mention this event. In 1942, he records in his diary that the ceremony had been conducted by a sensible clergyman in a pleasant and unassuming way. In his book, The Making of Dr. Faustus, his great novel, From Exile, he adds, the children have been anointed as Christians in the Unitarian Church with a minimum of religious pretensions in the most sensibly human ceremony. So the ritual forms are sensible because they are human, cutting back the religious pretensions of any institution, and the children are anointed as Christians. The sacrament, thus, is conceived as an initiation into a Christian, a human life. This is why Thomas Mann remembers the ceremony as, literally, the most gratifying experience in church I've ever had. Now, this sensible clergyman wasn't just anybody. Back in 1932, Reverend Ernest Caldecott had been one of the 43 signatories of the controversial Humanist Manifesto, endorsing political humanism as a form of religion, alongside such intellectuals as the philosopher John Dewey. Thomas Mann and the radical minister got along very well, as Caldecott's letter to Thomas Mann on his 70th birthday in 1954 illustrates. Here it is. My dear Dr. Mann, word has come to me that you have just passed your 70th birthday. I could hardly believe it, because on several occasions when I had the opportunity of meeting you, it would seem to me you were scarcely 60. I should like to express the hope that you will live as long as you desire to do so, but not a day longer. Cordially yours, Ernest Caldecott. So that's the tone. The choice of this minister to perform the baptisms of his 4 grandchildren was Thomas Mann's choice alone. A letter from April 1942 shows that just before the ceremony here, even Elizabeth Mann, the daughter, didn't know into which church her children would be baptized at all. She later recounted that they could only tell the minister Caldecott just before the ceremony that, you see, she said, we are just the children's parents. The minister almost fainted, she adds. So that was Thomas Mann's wish, alone. Although his insistence on Unitarian baptism was actually an act of heresy, the Protestant churches of the United States recognized neither the Unitarian Church nor its non-sacramental ceremonies as Christian. He continually insisted on the Christian origin and character of Unitarianism. That's how he saw it. At the crossroads of the Christian and the non-theistic alignment which the Unitarians faced in those days, Thomas Mann plainly advocates a liberal Christian orientation. There is another witness for that, an unknown document, indeed. In his very well-known great speech at the Library of Congress in 1942 on his novel Joseph and His Brothers, which he accomplished up in Pacific Palisades, Thomas Mann considered this literary and religious main work of his life in the light of his religious experience and translated the concept of the novel of religion as, he writes, attentiveness and obedience. Attentiveness to the inner changes of the world, the mutation in the aspects of truth and right. To live in sin is to live against the Spirit, to cling to the antiquated, obsolete, and to continue to live in it due to inattentiveness and disobedience. That's a well-known passage, but it's unknown that they are also quoted in another document. Thomas Mann published, indeed, an abridged version in a much less prominent place, as he called it, Christmas message, published in Ernest Caldicott's parish newsletter for the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles, as, in his own words, a summary of what I personally mean by religion. He only seriously professed it here, in statu confessionis, in the state of a personal confession, not just a theory. This is the background for his meeting with the man who would take Ernest Caldicott's place, and that, of course, was Stephen Frischmann. Intellectually acute, relentlessly engaging in political questions, radical, he had become chief editor of the most important Unitarian periodical in 1942. You know that better than me, probably. 5 years later, he lost this influential post after a sensational controversy drawn out over a year and a half in which he was denounced as a communist because of his openly socialist leaning. The so-called Frischmann crisis garnered nationwide public attention. There were hundreds and hundreds of articles all over the US. In the wake of this scandal, Frischmann became a popular minister with the Los Angeles congregation. In his sermons, books, and radio shows, he advocated African-American equality, social and political freedom, civil rights, and spoke out against abuses during the anti-communist hysteria of the McCarthy years. But already as early as in 1938, Frischmann's name had been at the top of the list of speakers at a rally in Boston. You see the little red mark up there, hopefully? Held under the motto, "A call to the people of Boston, protest Nazi terror against Jews and Catholics." The aims of his work as minister here in Los Angeles included reconciliation between Protestants, Catholics, Jews, theists, atheists, because communication with any person is part of the practice of our religion. Frischmann kept on defending diversity and individuality, a solidary community of free individuals. And he always insisted that the true nature of religion unfolds in these maxims. Only a few months after this Frischmann crisis, he met Thomas Mann. In him, the beleaguered Frischmann immediately found a supporter. It was that way round. And in the course of their 6-year acquaintance, he found a friend. Thomas Mann especially came to appreciate Frischmann as a fellow opponent of what he feared was the looming return of fascism in American disguise. Only 4 months after they had met for the first time, in June 1948, he wrote, with Erika Mann, his daughter's help, she was better in English, his first text backing Stephen Frischmann. Apparently, this paper directly referred to a sermon Frischmann had agreed to send him beforehand. In October 1948, Thomas Mann recorded in his diary that the sermon's topic was a protest against increasing breaches of the Constitution, such as imprisoning witnesses at will who refuse to inform on their friends. Already since the year before, Thomas Mann had felt, according to his diary, horribly affected by the ever-diminishing sense of justice in this country, by the dominance of fascist violence. I say this in August 2018. As you know, the Hollywood 10, whom the House Committee on Un-American Activities suspected of being communists, refused to testify and were sentenced to prison. On the same night already, Frischmann and his wife were invited to Pacific Palisades to coordinate their joint response. And Thomas Mann wrote a letter, as he says, a letter as a supplement to Frischmann's sermon against the ongoing erosion of constitutional and American freedom. Frischmann read out that letter in the pulpit, and the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles published it here, singularly naming both men as co-authors. Although the printed leaflet here looks rather humble, much humbler than most publications of Thomas Mann did, it had decisive consequences for both Frischmann and Thomas Mann. On April 4th, 1949, Life magazine carried a sensational article initiated by the FBI, probably Hoover himself. The article depicts 50 mugshots with captions that give only names and occupations, resembling a huge wanted poster. It goes on over 8 pages like that. Running under the headline, "Dupes and Fellow Travelers Dress Up Communist Fronts." The list reads like a who's who of liberal America at the time. Apart from Norman Mailer, Albert Einstein, Leonard Bernstein, Charlie Chaplin, and Arthur Miller, it also includes, as you can see here, Thomas Mann, novelist, and Stephen H. Frischmann, Unitarian clergyman. But to be a dupe with those guys, Frischmann commented later, is the greatest honor I have yet had in my 46 years. The extent to which these events intensified the personal relationship between the two men can be seen 11 months later in a separate, personal, even intimate moment. On March 11th, 1950, Heinrich Mann died. And as if self-evidently, Thomas Mann wanted to put the funeral ceremony of his brother in the hands of his Unitarian friend in Santa Monica. In their fight to preserve civil rights and resist the threats of the McCarthy era, Frischmann and Thomas Mann remained allies. In January 1951, when Frischmann was again a guest in Pacific Palisades, Thomas Mann commented on the visit. On the following day, in his diary, Frischmann yesterday, bestes Amerikanertum, being American at its best. You can't translate it. Being American at its best, Stephen Frischmann, yesterday. In his diary, he recorded gratefully and in an intimate tone, "Good letter from Fritsch regarding the persecutions." I return to that in a moment. First, Frischmann's letter, "Good letter from Fritsch regarding the persecutions." In original, it's English. Frischmann writes, among other things, just a word of understanding and strong support as you, Thomas Mann, received this criminally irresponsible criticism in the newspapers. In September, Frischmann was summoned before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. While Thomas Mann was in the end, but it was a dangerous situation for him too, spared interrogation, Congressman Donald Jackson denounced Thomas Mann publicly in Congress as one of the world's foremost apologists for Stalin and company, which actually meant a threat to throw him out of the country and send him back to Europe. At the height of public hostility, he received the letter that I'm about to quote from Frischmann, being American at its best. And here it is, the good letter from Fritsch regarding these persecutions. Just a word of understanding and strong support as you, Thomas Mann, receive this criminally irresponsible criticism in the newspapers. Your dignity and impressive achievements make their efforts fruitless to destroy either your character or your work. But it seems more than flesh and blood should have to bear. Your loyalty to your friends and your public, whatever their politics, is a continuing inspiration to all of us. In the biblical phrase, it seems more than flesh and blood should have to bear, doubly persecuted Thomas Mann, first in Nazi Germany, then in the US, edged close to the apostles. Quite deliberately, it evoked the sentence from Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers." Indeed, this is a good letter from Frisch regarding the persecutions. And Thomas Mann answered immediately. Beside their common cause, what seems conspicuous is his tone and the way he emphasizes his personal connection, both with Frischmann and with his church. He not only thanks him for your kind letter, but also politely mentions even the church's annual report enclosed with the letter, which, like everything coming from your sphere, I have read with interest. Your words gave me much comfort. Men like you are needed in this country today in greater numbers as they apparently are to be found. After some remarks on the political situation, Thomas Mann concludes this letter to Frischmann with much more warmth than convention would have demanded, with repeated thanks, kindest greetings, and my best wishes for your work. I am very sincerely yours, Thomas Mann. Their friendship continued in the same vein. In his memoirs, published in 1977, and characteristically titled Heretic, Frischmann himself describes this friendship in detail. He remembers Thomas Mann of those years, Leon and Martha Feuchtwanger, as members indeed, members, he writes, of this parish. Two hitherto unknown letters from 1950 highlight how much Thomas Mann at that time actually identified with Unitarianism in general, and with this congregation in particular. Under these circumstances, it comes as no surprise that Thomas Mann himself should finally climb Frischmann's pulpit here in the First Unitarian Church in March 1951. The talk he gave constitutes his most extensive and explicit commentary on Unitarianism and warrants closer scrutiny. In his diary, on Sunday, March 4th, 1951, he writes, "The room was crowded. Nice choir with solo and organ, polyglot, Russian, Chinese, delivered my speech well. There almost was applause," which is understandable. The speech leaves no doubt about the speaker's serious commitment to the place and occasion. His reminiscences on both his intellectual and personal connection with the church soon give way to passages characterized by a surprisingly confessional vehemence. And this is really worth quoting today. By no means it is a matter of mere politeness or conventional courtesy when I state that I am happy to be with you today. For many years past, Unitarianism has been close to my heart, and I have more particularly been rather intimately connected with the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles. Last March, his minister, the Reverend Stephen Frischmann, most movingly conducted the funeral rites for my dear brother Heinrich. My 4 grandchildren, Native Americans all, he says Native Americans, were received into the Unitarian Church by baptism. And rarely, if ever, have I taken so lively and militant an interest in the activities of any religious group as I keep taking in the Unitarians' manifold efforts and doings. Why should this be so? I am a Lutheran and owe a great deal to the German Protestant tradition into which I was born, as it were, and which contributed substantially to my spiritual and cultural makeup. Even so, and for my own person, I always incline to see in religion something rather broader, more generally moral and ethical, than that which could, as a rule, be expected to manifest itself within the confines of any one dogma. Unitarianism here does not emerge as just another denomination, but as a recognition of a human, interdenominational unity of the human spirit, to use his own expression, unity of the human spirit, which as such became the precondition for exemplary moral action, as we heard before. Thomas Mann acknowledged that and continued, "Today, more urgently perhaps than ever before, what is needed is applied religion, applied Christianity, or if you prefer, a new religiously tainted humanism, aggressively bent on bettering man's status and condition on earth, while at the same time honoring and bowing in reverence to the secret which lies at the bottom of all human existence, and which must and will never be lifted, for it is holy. If Unitarianism as such fairly approximates this sort of rejuvenated, religiously tainted humanism, the Unitarian Service Committee would seem most peculiarly and most directly to obey what might be called the order of the day. And this, of course, the order of the day, was the very title of his own collection of political essays, published in 1942 in the United States. When Thomas Mann describes the profoundest religious mystery, he leaves in abeyance how far this should be understood in theological or in anthropological terms. This mystery must and will never be lifted, for it is holy, indicating that the genuinely religious confession does not coincide with humanism, but precedes it. Thomas Mann goes on, the term Unitarianism, widely unknown until then, became, for us German immigrants, tantamount to the terms of help, escape, safety. Soon, and in many additional parts of the world, including, of course, the US, it also came to mean readjustment, restoration, medical assistance, childcare, housing, or, in short, applied Christianity. In this spirit, Thomas Mann explicitly draws on Frischmann's and Theodore Parker's writing, among others. Consequently, the last sentences of his speech resume the American and biblical resonances. And now it's really emotional. My friends, I know full well that it is far later than some of us might think, and that the efforts of any one small group among us, however brave and admirable, are not in actual fact likely to prove capable of stemming a tide, the devilishness and deadliness of which we are not foolish enough to underestimate. That's a Thomas Mann sentence, really. Nevertheless, and although it is virtually against hope that we keep hoping, the good fight put up by America's Unitarians and their service committee constitutes one of the most encouraging, strengthening, and nerving demonstrations staged against the powers of darkness at this our time in this our country. Our country, that is America, for him. As you notice, hope against all hope. The good fight against devilish and deadly powers of darkness, political engagement as applied Christianity. Thomas Mann's democratic rhetoric is well versed in the Bible. And he talks about all this on his own accord. An advertisement in the church section of the Los Angeles Times on the previous day announced the event here in the First Unitarian Church with the title, The Unfinished Task, the work of the Unitarian Service Committee. And of course, that's much narrower than the topics that Thomas Mann expanded upon. In his memoirs, Frischmann notes, the most impressive pulpit editorial of my Los Angeles ministry was given in March of 1951 when Thomas Mann spoke to a filled auditorium of well over 800. It still gives me joy just to recall some of those words. The most impressive pulpit editorial in the 22 years of his ministry. Frischmann's emphatic judgment is not only due, as you might think, to the mere popularity of the speaker. Nobel Prize winners Linus Pauling or the writer Leon Feuchtwanger would be candidates too. Frischmann had a different reason to ascribe this singular importance to Thomas Mann's speech. Dr. Mann's brief editorial, he adds, helped to define the concept of religion we were attempting to circulate in those days. That is a strong sentence indeed. It was a day of sorrow for Francis and me, Frischmann remembers, when Dr. Mann returned to Europe. We would miss those visits to the house in Pacific Palisades. Thomas Mann's lively and militant interest in Unitarianism survived the struggles of exile and his return to Europe. Anyway, Mann and Frischmann did not lose contact. As late as December 1954, Thomas Mann records in his diary, among notes on world affairs, wrote to Frischmann, Unitarian Church, give money. This last message, written in Kilchberg, Switzerland, 8 months before his death, is Thomas Mann's last word to Frischmann. Again, he remembers the familiar relationship to the Unitarian Church, and quite solemnly, the private letter changes into a final message. Leaving this personal side aside, the spirit of your church the Christian humanism which she advocates and which you humbly and bravely proclaim, it is this spirit that attracts me since I learned about it and which I admire in true sympathy. Today, everyone speaks about the necessity to defend speech, freedom, and human dignity against totalitarian tyranny and coercion to conform alien to Western civilization. Without fail and at its sacrifice, the Unitarian Church represents these Western and Christian ideals in all their purity. Again, purity and sacrifice, these are terms from martyrology, which are here applied to the actions of a vulnerable congregation. The letter closes with a candid declaration of solidarity. These sacrifices have to and will be repaid. All those for whom your church is a source of spiritual inspiration will rally to provide compensation. From abroad, I will contribute to this effort with the means of an author who does not write for a mass audience. And I ask you, dear Minister Frischmann, to give my kindest wishes for Christmas and the New Year to your congregation. They are wishes of peace, and they are for a humankind united in their progress towards what is good, your friend Thomas Mann. Yet no other document illustrates the spiritual affinity more clearly than a portrait photograph which Thomas Mann sent to Frischmann in March 1951 with a handwritten dedication to Stephen Frischmann, defender of American evangelic freedom, Thomas Mann. Note that he doesn't say Protestant, but evangelic, meaning that he appreciates Frischmann's actions as according to the gospel. American freedom in that sense, in Whitman's sense. This true sympathy lasted even after death. For a long time, Frischmann would cite Thomas Mann as a friend and as a teacher in several of his writings. When Thomas Mann died in 1955, Frischmann gave a moving memorial speech here in this congregation. Addressing attempts to play off Thomas Mann, the apostle of democracy, against the renowned poet, Frischmann praises Mann's selfless courage in the face of derisive attacks, a courage which puts him in line with even saints and prophets. He really says that. Dr. Mann was dedicated with the dedication of a saint to the task of holding unreason in check. Like an Old Testament prophet, an Ezekiel or a Jeremiah, he delivered himself at times of a magnificent, though to some people absurd, confidence in the resources of mankind. Thus, Frischmann says that from his pulpit of Mann standing in the same place where Mann had stood to address his congregation. Some of you, I'm sure, heard him in pulpits including this one. He then speaks of the continuing and discreet financial contributions which Thomas Mann made even from Europe to resist, as Frischmann puts it, the encroachment of the state upon the freedom of the church. And he continues, he gave us all strength and courage, joy and pride in our limited personal human resources. And referring to this work, this side of Thomas Mann's work, always underestimated, Frischmann concludes his work will survive for years to come. Thank you so much.